Welcome to Dusk Almanac. Settle in and close your eyes. Tonight we drift through another story, and the night is long. The dark is absolute, not the dark of a room with curtains drawn, not the dark of a city after midnight, but the deep, depthless dark of a northern coast in the hour before the world remembers it exists, a dark so complete it has texture, has weight, has a taste like iron and salt on the back of your tongue. Somewhere below, the sea moves against stone. You can hear it before you can see it. That low, rhythmic breathing of water against rock, patient and ancient, the oldest sound on earth. The air is cold, not merely cool, not brisk, but the kind of cold that finds the gaps between wool and skin, that presses against your cheekbones like the flat of a blade, that makes the lungs tighten with each breath, as though the body must be reminded again and again that it is alive. And through that cold, drifting from somewhere inland, just barely, the smell of smoke, pine smoke, warm and resinous, faintly sweet, threading through the salt air like a whispered sentence in a language you almost understand. This is a fjord in western Norway, the early 9th century. The year, if you could ask anyone here, would mean nothing. They do not count time as you do, not yet, not in the way of monks and chronicles. What they know is the season. It is late spring. The ice has pulled back from the shallows. The days have begun to stretch. But this morning, the sun has not yet crested the ridge of mountains to the east, and the settlement that sits at the head of this narrow inlet is still held in the blue-black silence of almost night. Smoke rises from a long house, set back from the water, its turf roof dark and heavy with dew, its timber walls blackened by years of weather and fire. Inside, the long fire glows. The long fire is the heart of everything. It runs down the center of the house like a spine, a low trench of embers, perhaps 10 meters long, banked with ash and fed through the night with split pine and birch. The smoke has no chimney to escape through. It simply rises, drifts, fills the upper darkness of the roof space with a soft, shifting haze that stings the eyes and scents every surface, every garment, every strand of hair. The walls breathe with it. The wool blankets carry it. If you were to press your face into the rough weave of a cloak hanging by the door, you would smell that smoke. And beneath it, lanolin, and beneath that, the faint animal warmth of the sheep it came from. This is a house that smells of life, of tallow, rendered fat, poured into shallow stone lamps whose wicks gutter now in the last hour before dawn, of dried fish stored in the rafters, of the livestock penned at the far end of the building, their breath warm and grassy, their heavy bodies shifting in the straw. Norse longhouses could stretch up to 30 meters in length, nearly the span of a modern swimming pool, and they held everything under one roof. Family and animals shared the same structure, divided by low partitions of wood or wattle. The central long fire provided heat and light and the means to cook, but it also created a permanent interior climate of smoke and warmth that preserved the timbers and, according to some scholars, helped to keep insects at bay. Raised platforms along the walls served as benches by day and beds by night, layered with furs and woolen blankets. There were no windows to speak of. Light entered through the doorway, through the smoke hole in the roof, and through the fire itself. To live in a longhouse was to live in a kind of permanent dusk, a warm, close, smoke-tinged twilight that shaped the rhythms of conversation and sleep and story. And in that twilight now, someone is awake. A woman sits on the edge of a sleeping platform near the fire, and between her knees, facing away, a child, perhaps 5, perhaps 6, sits still while the woman's hands work through the child's hair, separating it into 3 pale strands, pulling them tight, weaving them over and under with a practiced rhythm that requires no sight. The braid takes shape beneath her fingers. She ties it with a strip of leather. The child does not speak. The woman does not speak. There is only the soft sound of breathing, the faint crackle of the embers settling, and somewhere outside, far down the slope toward the water, the low groan of timber. That sound is the Nost, the boathouse. Built at the waterline where the fjord meets the shore, the Nost is an open-ended timber structure with a slipway running directly into the sea, a kind of cradle for the ship, designed so that a vessel can be hauled up above the tide line for winter storage and slid back into the water when the season turns. Many of these structures survive archaeologically along the Norwegian coast today, their stone foundations still visible, their dimensions telling us precisely how large the ships were that once rested inside them. Some held vessels of 20 meters or more. The timbers of the Nost creak with the tide, swelling and contracting as the water rises and falls. And on a still morning, before the wind comes up, you can hear them from 100 meters away. It is the sound of a ship waiting to move. Imagine you are standing at the door of the longhouse now, looking out. The sky has begun to shift, not to light, not yet, but to a kind of luminous darkness, a deep blue that is almost gray, the color of a bruise fading. The fjord is a black mirror below you, perfectly still, and the mountains on either side are shapes without detail, enormous, silent, felt more than seen. The air is sharp enough to make your teeth ache. You pull the cloak tighter, undyed wool, coarse against your neck, heavy with moisture, and you can feel the cold pressing through it, pressing against your ribs, your wrists, the thin skin behind your ears. Somewhere a bird calls, a single note, then silence, then the sea again, that patient exhalation against the stones. This is the world that will produce the Viking Age, a period conventionally dated from 793, when Norse raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of northern England, to 1066, when a Norwegian king fell at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire. 273 years. In that span, the people of this cold, smoke-scented, tide-governed world would sail to places no European had ever reached, would stand on the shores of North America, would trade in the markets of Baghdad, would serve as the personal guard of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. They would carve laws that echo in modern parliaments. They would compose poetry of such beauty and precision that scholars, 1,000 years later, would struggle to translate it without weeping. But that is later. That is the story still to come. There is a detail here, one that is easy to overlook in the grand sweep of raids and sagas and ocean crossings, that reframes the whole picture. Before any of it begins, before the first longship cuts the gray water of the North Sea, before any monastery burns, before any rune is carved into any foreign stone, there's this: a woman braiding a child's hair in the dark, a fire kept alive through the night, the creak of a boathouse at the edge of the tide. The Norse world did not begin with violence. It began with patience, with the tending of fires in houses that had to be rebuilt each generation. with the curing of fish and the spinning of wool and the long necessary labor of building a ship plank by plank. Each strake of oak or pine split along the grain, not sawn, so the wood would keep its strength, so it would flex with the sea rather than fight it. The ships were not weapons. They were instruments of survival, and the hands that built them were the same hands that milked goats in the gray light of a winter morning, that ground grain between flat stones that held children close against the cold. The same hands that reached in the dark for another piece of wood to lay upon the fire. Outside the longhouse, the darkness is thinning. The sky along the eastern ridge is no longer blue, but the color of pale ash, and the first details are beginning to emerge from the shadow. The outline of the Nost below, the curve of the hull inside it, the faint gleam of water where the slipway meets the fjord. The air smells of pine resin and seaweed and the damp earth of the path that leads down to the shore. Somewhere, a goat bleats once and falls silent. A door opens, the soft scrape of wood on packed earth. And now there are voices, low and unhurried, and the sound of footsteps on wet stone. The day is arriving. Soon, the ship will launch. But for one more breath, just one, the world holds still. The embers glow in the longhouse. The braid holds tight in the child's hair. The tide turns beneath the Nost, and the timbers groan, and the mountains stand like witnesses in the gray, and the air carries the smell of smoke from a fire that someone, in the dark, chose to keep burning. Beyond the ridge, the sky brightens by a single shade. The fjord receives it without a sound. That is where this story begins. Not with a raid, not with a war, with a fire tended in the dark, with a braid, with the patient sound of the sea. The darkness came early and stayed long. In the northern reaches of Scandinavia, in the fjords of what is now Norway, along the frost-cracked coasts of Iceland, the sun, by late November, barely cleared the horizon before falling again. A pale coin pressed briefly against the rim of the world and then withdrawn. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The rivers thickened. The ground rang like iron beneath the heel. The wind, which had been merely cold, became something else entirely. A low, ceaseless pressure against every surface. A sound like breathing that never stopped, that worked its way beneath doors and through cracks in timber, and into the bones of anyone foolish enough to stand still in it for long. And the people moved indoors. They had been preparing for months. The fish had been split and salted and hung in drying sheds where the wind could strip the moisture from the flesh. The barley had been harvested and stored in pits lined with birch bark. Juniper berries had been gathered from the hillsides, nettles dried and bundled for the soups that would carry families through the darkest weeks. The livestock that could not be fed through winter had been slaughtered at the autumn blot, and their meat smoked over slow fires of alder and birch. Everything that could be preserved had been preserved. Everything that could be mended had been mended. And now the world contracted to a single room. The longhouse. If you have never stood inside a reconstructed one, it is difficult to convey its particular atmosphere, the way it holds you, the way the air itself feels different the moment you cross the threshold. Experimental archaeology at sites like Læsra, the land of legends in Denmark, has rebuilt these structures to their original specifications, long, low buildings of timber and turf, some stretching 30 meters or more, their roofs heavy with packed earth and living grass, their walls thick enough to muffle the worst of the wind outside. And down the center of that long, dim interior ran the fire. Not a hearth in the modern sense, not a contained thing, but an open trench of embers and low flame, sometimes stretching 5 or 6 meters along the packed earth floor, filling the entire space with a wavering amber light that moved on the walls like something alive. The smoke rose slowly toward the roof ridge, where it found its way out through narrow vents, and the air inside carried the smell of it always. Wood smoke and animal fat, and the faint sweetness of burning birch bark, layered over something deeper, earthier, the smell of the turf walls themselves, breathing moisture in the heat. It was warm, surprisingly, remarkably warm. The experiments at Lejre confirmed what archaeologists had long suspected: a well-maintained long fire, combined with the insulating mass of turf walls and the body heat of the people and animals housed within, could maintain livable temperatures even through a Scandinavian January. The cold outside could reach 20 or 30 degrees below freezing. Inside, by the fire, it was the temperature of a cool autumn afternoon. Along both walls ran the sleeping platforms, raised wooden benches, wide enough for 2 or 3 people, layered with sheepskins and woolen blankets, positioned just above the cold floor, where the warmth from the fire pooled and gathered. Families slept together. In the deepest cold, the warmth of 10 or 12 bodies layered close beneath heavy wool became something almost luxurious. Children pressed against the bodies of their parents and grandparents. The wood of the platforms creaked when someone turned in the night, a sound as familiar and unconscious as breathing. And from the far end of the longhouse came the low shuffle and warmth of cattle, penned in their own section of the same building, their animal heat radiating down the length of the room toward the living quarters. The boundaries between human life and animal life were thin here. The boundaries between waking and sleeping were thinner still. In the deep winter months, when the sun might appear for only 3 or 4 hours, or in the far north, not at all, the rhythm of the day was governed not by light, but by fire, by hunger, by the slow turning of tasks that kept hands busy and minds from drifting into the gray weight of the dark. Imagine you are sitting on one of those platforms, your back against the curved timber wall, your knees drawn up beneath a wool blanket that smells of lanolin and smoke. The fire in the central trench has been banked low for the evening, and its light reaches you in soft pulses. Amber, then shadow, then amber again. The air is warm near your face, but cool at your shoulders, where the wall breathes cold through the turf. You can hear the wind outside, not as a howl, but as a constant, muffled presence, the way you might hear the sea from inside a ship's hull. Somewhere to your left, a child is pushing a small carved horse across the edge of the sleeping platform. You can hear the soft scrape of wood on wood, a sound so quiet it would vanish in daylight, but here, in the hush of the fire, it carries. And somewhere ahead, near the flames, someone is stirring a pot, and the smell reaches you in waves. Barley, dried fish, the green bitterness of nettles gathered months ago and crumbled now into the broth. This was the staple meal. Archaeobotanical evidence from Norse sites across Scandinavia, from the farmsteads of Jutland to the turf houses of Iceland, tells a remarkably consistent story of what sustained people through the dark months. The daily diet centered on barley porridge and pottage, thickened with whatever was at hand: dried cod or herring, preserved dairy in the form of skyr or fermented whey, and wild-gathered plants whose flavors we can still reconstruct from carbonized seeds in hearth ash. Juniper appeared frequently, lending its sharp, resinous warmth to broths and to the ale that was brewed in enormous quantities during the winter months, fermented with wild yeast and sometimes flavored with bog myrtle or yarrow. The ale was not a luxury. It was a caloric necessity, a source of nourishment and interior warmth, and its brewing, the long patient process of malting and mashing and waiting, became one of the defining rhythms of the indoor season. The smell of fermenting grain hung in the longhouse air for days, sweet and yeasty and strangely alive. But the most important thing that happened in the dark was not the eating or the brewing or the mending of nets and tools, essential as all of those were. The most important thing was speech, story, the human voice reaching into the space that light could not, holding the community together through the long silence of the season. The Norse were, before anything else, a people of the spoken word. Their histories were not written down during the Viking Age itself. The sagas would not be committed to vellum until the 12th and 13th centuries in Iceland, and so the entire architecture of their past, their laws, their genealogies, their understanding of how the cosmos was made and how it would end, existed only in the memory of those who could speak it aloud. Winter was when that speaking happened most intensely. The skalds recited, the elders told, the children listened with their faces warm from the fire and their eyes half closed, and the stories entered them the way warmth enters the body, slowly, deeply, becoming part of the structure that holds a person upright in the world. And among the most prized forms of this verbal art was the riddle. The Norse called them gatur, and they were not the simple puzzles we might imagine, not children's games, though children surely played them too. They were a formal intellectual tradition, a test of wit and associative thought that carried real social weight. To answer a riddle well was to demonstrate that you understood the hidden structures beneath the surface of things, the way one thing could be another thing, the way language itself could fold and double back to reveal what plain speech never could. The tradition ran so deep that it shaped even the mythology. In the Old Norse poem, Alvismal, preserved in the Poetic Edda, the god Thor engages a dwarf named Alvis, whose name means all-wise, in a riddling contest that is really a meditation on the nature of language itself. Thor asks the dwarf to name the same thing in the tongues of different beings, the sun, the moon, the wind, the sea, in the language of the gods, of the elves, of the giants, of the dead. Each answer opens a different window onto the same world. The sun is called the Ever-Bright by the gods, the Fair Wheel by the elves, Dvalin's Delight by the dwarves. And the poem does not resolve with violence or conquest. It resolves with dawn. Thor keeps the dwarf talking through the night until the sun rises and turns Alvis to stone. Knowledge, in this tradition, was not merely power. It was time itself, the ability to hold another mind in place until the world changed around it. There is a detail here, one that scholars of material culture have pieced together only in recent decades, that quietly reframes the intimacy of these winter nights. Among the small objects excavated from Norse domestic sites, found again and again in the soil of longhouse floors, are toys. tiny carved animals, horses mostly, but also birds and boats, figures that might be people or might be gods, their features worn soft by handling, whittled from scraps of pine or birch, smoothed by a blade, and then smoothed further by the persistent grip of small fingers. They are rarely mentioned in the written sources. They carry no runes, no inscriptions, but they survive in the packed clay, where they were dropped and forgotten, pressed into the earth of a floor that has not been walked on for 1,000 years, and they tell us something that no saga ever needed to say aloud. That in the longest darkness, in the deep of a winter that lasted half the year, someone sat by the fire with a knife and a scrap of wood and carved something small and useless and careful and placed it into the hands of a child who was waiting, and the child held it close, and the fire burned on, and outside the snow continued to fall on a world that, for now, did not need to be answered, only endured, only outlasted, only loved quietly in the dark. But there was another direction, one that history has been slower to remember. While longships cut west through the gray Atlantic swell toward Lindisfarne and the rain-dark coasts of Ireland, other ships, lighter, shallower drafted, built not for ocean crossings, but for rivers, slipped quietly east into a vastness that no saga would make famous and that most schoolbooks still ignore. They followed rivers, not the open sea, but the long braided waterways that threaded south and east through birch forest and marshland, through what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, rivers whose names read like a whispered litany: the Dnieper, the Don, the Dvina, and above all, the Volga, that immense silver corridor that carried small groups of Norse traders deeper into the continental interior than any Scandinavian had ever gone before. The air here smelled different, not of salt and open sky, but of black river mud, of pine resin warming in the summer heat, of peat smoke drifting low across the water at dusk. The sound was different too, not the crash of surf against a hull, but the slow rhythmic creak of oars in still water, the soft knock of a keel against submerged roots, and somewhere ahead, always ahead, the murmur of a language none of them had been born speaking. These were the Varangians, the Norse traders and warriors who turned their ambition inland and southward, opening trade routes of extraordinary length and complexity. The word itself likely derives from Old Norse, meaning something close to sworn companions, or men of the pledge, and it carried weight in the courts of the East long before it was forgotten in the West. They traveled in small, heavily armed bands, portaging their boats overland between river systems, dragging vessels across mudflats and forest clearings, sometimes for miles, to connect one waterway to the next, stitching together a route that eventually linked the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and beyond it to Constantinople, the richest city on earth. Others followed the Volga farther still, south and east, until the trade roads opened onto the markets of the Abbasid Caliphate, into a world of silk, spice, and silver that would have seemed, to a farmer's son from Burka or Gotland, like something conjured from a fever dream. The distance they covered was immense. The ambition behind it was older than any map, and the evidence is not speculation. It is metal. Archaeologists have found over 100,000 Arabic silver dirhams buried across Scandinavia, in hoards, in graves, in the dark foundations of farmsteads from Sweden to Denmark to Norway. most of them dating to the 9th and 10th centuries. 100,000 coins, minted in Baghdad, in Samarkand, in the great cities of the Islamic Golden Age, then carried north by hand along rivers and forest tracks until they came to rest in Scandinavian soil. Each one is a receipt. Each one is proof that a transaction took place, that someone in the north had something the south wanted, and that the south paid in silver. The goods flowing southward were furs, honey, amber, walrus ivory, and, it must be said plainly, enslaved human beings, captured in raids across the Baltic and Eastern Europe. The goods flowing north were coins, silk, glass beads, and spices, whose fragrance would have been utterly foreign in a Norse longhouse. Cardamom, saffron, cloves. Two worlds, separated by thousands of miles of forest and steppe, were joined by the stubbornness of men in shallow boats. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the bank of the Volga in midsummer, somewhere near the trading post of Bulgar, in what is now central Russia. The river is wide here, so wide that a voice calling from the far bank would dissolve before it ever reached you. The water moves slowly, catching the light in long shifting planes of silver and amber. The air is warm and thick, heavy with the smell of river mud, of animal hides stretched on wooden frames, of something sharper beneath it. Cardamom, perhaps, or the dry sweet dust of saffron, carried in leather pouches from markets 1,000 miles to the south. Around you, the sounds layer and overlap. The knock of hulls against a rough timber dock, the low murmur of negotiation in half a dozen languages, the clink of metal on a weighing scale, the call of a bird whose name you do not know. You are very far from home, and yet everywhere you look, you see the familiar. The cut of a Norse tunic, the flash of a Thor's hammer pendant at a man's throat. This is the edge of the known world. Your people are already here. It was in a place much like this, along the Volga, in the year 922, that one of the most remarkable documents of the entire Viking Age was born. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat and scholar serving the Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir, had been dispatched on a diplomatic mission to the king of the Volga Bulgars. Along the way, he encountered a group of Norse traders, the people he called the Rus, and what he wrote about them would become the most detailed, most precise external description of Norse people ever recorded by an outside observer. Ibn Fadlan was meticulous. He was also, by his own cultural standards, frequently appalled and utterly fascinated. But his account is invaluable precisely because it is written from the outside, from the perspective of someone with no stake in Norse self-image, no reason to flatter or mythologize. He simply wrote what he saw. He described them as tall as palm trees, fair and reddish in complexion, each man tattooed from fingernails to neck in patterns of dark green. Trees, figures, intricate designs that covered the skin like living ornament. He noted that every man carried an axe, a sword, and a knife, and was never parted from them. He described the women's dress, the brooches pinned at each shoulder, the rings of gold and silver stacked around their necks, worn not for beauty alone, but as visible, portable wealth. He described their hygiene with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, noting that they washed their faces each morning from a shared basin, a practice that deeply offended his own more scrupulous customs. And he described their rituals at the riverside with the steady, unblinking gaze of a man watching something genuinely foreign. Their offerings to tall, carved wooden figures, their prayers for successful trading, their solemn gestures before gods whose names he did not record. The detail is astonishing. Reading his words 1,000 years later, you can feel the texture of that encounter. Two civilizations studying each other across a fire, across a barrier of language, across an immense gulf of custom and belief. Neither fully understood the other. Both left records. The name these Eastern Norse carried, Rus, would prove more durable than their ships, their language, or their bloodlines. Scholars believe it derives from the Old Norse word roder, meaning rowing or the rowers, a term that may have originally described their method of river travel rather than any deeper identity. But the name attached itself to the land. It clung to the rivers, to the portage routes, to the settlements that thickened along the trade roads. The city of Kiev, now Kiev, was established as a major Norse Varangian settlement in the 9th century and became the seat of a dynasty whose influence would stretch across centuries. The Rurikid dynasty, traditionally founded by a Norse chieftain named Rurik around 862, governed the lands of Kievan Rus for over 700 years. And the word Rus, born, scholars believe, in the rhythmic dip of an oar, became Russia. A name that began in a rowboat became the name of the largest country on Earth. But there is a detail here, one that earlier generations of scholars tended to overlook, that reframes the entire story of the Norse East. This was not merely a route of extraction, it was a route of dissolution. The Varangians who traveled east did not simply gather wealth and sail home. Many stayed. They married into local Slavic and Finnic populations, adopted Eastern Orthodox Christianity, learned languages their grandfathers had never heard, and slowly, over 2, 3, 4 generations, ceased to be Norse at all. They dissolved into the cultures they had entered, like salt into warm water, leaving behind only scattered genes, a handful of place names, and that single stubborn word, Rus, echoing forward through the centuries like a stone dropped into still water, whose ripples have never fully disappeared. And still the silver came north. On the island of Gotland alone, a single island in the Baltic, no larger than a modest county, archaeologists have recovered more Arabic silver than in any other location in Europe. The hoards lie beneath green fields where sheep still graze in the rain, in soil that smells of wet chalk and old grass, and deep, patient time. Some of the coins are whole, their Kufic inscriptions still legible after a millennium. Others have been cut into careful fragments, hack silver, the Norse called it, weighed and traded by the gram rather than by denomination. Because in the Norse economy, silver was silver, regardless of whose caliph or emir had pressed his name upon it. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture one of these dirhams resting in your palm. It is lighter than you expected, thin, slightly concave, cool against the skin. The Arabic script is small and precise, pressed into metal that has not seen daylight in 1,000 years. It was minted in a city you may never visit, carried by hands you will never know, and buried by someone who intended to return for it. They never did. The earth held it instead, through winters and thaws, through the slow forgetting of names, until someone knelt in a Swedish field with a trowel and brought it back into the light. And for a moment, holding it, the distance between two lives collapsed into nothing more than the weight of a single coin, warm now from the heat of a living hand. They came from the north, from granite shores and pine darkness, from the smell of wood smoke trapped in wool and the sound of rain on birch bark, from places where the winter sky pressed down like the flat of a cold hand. And they walked into a city made of light. The arrangement was, at its heart, a transaction. In approximately 988, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II faced a crisis that threatened to unseat him from the most powerful throne in Christendom. He needed soldiers, not the unreliable local levies or the scheming aristocratic commanders who had already betrayed him, but men with no ties to Byzantine politics, no local allegiances, no reason to turn. He found them through a deal with Vladimir I of Kievan Rus, who sent a force of some 6,000 Norse and Slavic warriors south to Constantinople as part of a sweeping diplomatic agreement. One that also involved Vladimir's conversion to Orthodox Christianity and his marriage to Basil's sister, Anna. It was a bargain between desperate men. It created something that would endure for more than 2 centuries. These warriors became the Varangian Guard, from the Old Norse varar, meaning sworn men, men bound by oath. And they were installed as the personal bodyguard of the emperor himself. Not garrison troops posted to some distant frontier, not soldiers embedded in the tangled hierarchies of Byzantine command. These were the emperor's shadow, standing at his shoulder in the golden throne room, sleeping in shifts outside his chamber door, carrying the great broad-bladed Dane axes that became their terrifying signature. Their loyalty was not to Byzantium's politics, or its faith, or its quarreling factions. It was to the office of the emperor, to whoever sat the throne, however he had come to sit there. And this, paradoxically, is precisely what made them invaluable. They were foreigners. They would always remain foreigners, and so they could be trusted as no Byzantine nobleman ever could. Imagine arriving. Imagine you are 23 years old, born in a coastal settlement of perhaps 200 souls on a Norwegian fjord, a place where the loudest sound on a still night is the creak of a moored boat, and the softest is snow settling on thatch. You have seen Bergen, maybe, the largest town you know, a harbor of a few thousand people, where the air smells of tar and salt cod. And now you are walking through the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, into a city that holds somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 people. By an almost incomprehensible margin, the largest city in Europe, larger than Rome, larger than Paris, larger than anything in the Islamic world, except perhaps Baghdad. The noise alone would have been staggering. The press of bodies, the heat, that heavy, humid Mediterranean heat that sits on northern skin like a warm, damp hand. The Byzantines called their capital simply the city, Hipolis, as though no other city existed or mattered. And for a young man raised among timber longhouses and turf roofs, surrounded now by marble colonnades and gilded domes and streets that ran with fresh water from aqueducts built 700 years before he was born, it must have seemed as though no other city could. The scent of the place alone, jasmine and sewage, roasting meat and incense, dust and rosewater, would have been a world unto itself. Byzantine sources describe the Varangians with a mixture of admiration and faint amusement. These tall, pale, often red-haired men from the edge of the known world, prone to heavy drinking, ferocious in battle, strangely sentimental. They were paid extraordinarily well. They were permitted, upon the death of each emperor, to enter the imperial palace treasury and take what they could carry, a tradition the Byzantines called polytimion, the palace pillage. Many Varangians returned home wealthy, beyond imagination. Some never returned at all. And still, what lingers across the centuries is not the wealth, not the military campaigns, not even the strangeness of their position. Norse pagans and recent converts guarding the most Christian emperor on earth. What lingers is the quiet of individual lives. If you had asked one of these men what he remembered most about Constantinople, the answer might not have been the battles or the gold. It might have been something small, the taste of a fruit he had no name for, the weight of summer air at noon, the way Greek syllables rose and fell in patterns his ear could never quite predict. Almost everything about those private moments is lost to us now. Almost everything, but not quite. There is a detail here, one small surviving thing, that reframes this entire story. High in the upper gallery of the Hagia Sophia, which stood as the largest cathedral in the world for nearly 1,000 years, someone once carved into the pale marble balustrade. Not a prayer, not a devotion to Christ or to the Virgin, a name in runes. The inscription, partly worn away by centuries of hands and weather and the slow erosion of time, reads, as far as scholars have been able to decipher, Halfdan carved these runes. That is all. Halfdan. A Norse name, scratched into Byzantine marble by a man who stood in a building so vast that the central dome seems to float, untethered, above a nave thick with the smoke of frankincense and the low gold shimmer of millions of mosaic tesserae catching candlelight. He must have carried a knife, or perhaps used the point of his axe. He stood in the very spot where tourists lean today, and he wrote his name in the language of his home, in a church built for a god he may or may not have believed in a city that was not his, in a script that no one around him could read. Close your eyes for a moment. You are standing in that upper gallery. Below you, the nave opens into a space so enormous, it seems to bend sound itself. Voices from the floor arrive softened, dissolved, as though they have traveled not merely through air, but through centuries. The marble beneath your palm is cool, almost cold, even in a Constantinople summer, and smooth in the way that only stone polished by 1,000 years of passing hands can be smooth. The air is heavy with incense, not the thin, sharp incense of a small northern church, but something dense and resinous and almost sweet, layered over the faint mineral smell of ancient stone and the warmth of beeswax candles burning in iron sconces far below. Above you, gold tesserae catch the light in shifting, trembling patterns, not static, not still, but alive, as though the walls themselves are breathing with the movement of flame. And there, beneath your fingertips, you feel it. Letters, grooves cut into marble, shallow, certain. A name left by someone who wanted the stone to know he had been here. The Varangian Guard endured for centuries. The unit remained active until at least the 1200s, long after its ranks had been swelled by Anglo-Saxon warriors fleeing England after the Norman conquest of 1066, men who had lost one kingdom and found service in another, carrying their grief along the same river roads the Norse had opened. They fought across Anatolia, southern Italy, and the Levant. They served wise emperors and foolish ones. Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Guard as a young man, arriving in Constantinople around 1034. He left a decade later, richer than most kings, carrying stories that would echo through the sagas for generations. But the sagas record what was extraordinary. They do not record what was quiet. They do not tell us what it felt like to hear the muezzin's call from a minaret for the first time, or to taste pomegranate, or to feel silk against skin that had only ever known wool and linen. They do not tell us what a man from Trondheim thought when he sat in the hippodrome and watched chariot races roar past in a blur of dust and color before 80,000 strangers. They do not tell us whether he missed the sound of rain falling on a fjord, or the clean smell of pine resin in cold air, or the particular quality of northern light in late summer, when the sun barely sets and the sky turns the color of pale honey, and the world feels, for a few still hours, like it might never grow dark. And yet someone, Halfdan, or a man very like Halfdan, stood in a gallery of gold and silence, surrounded by the murmur of a liturgy he could not follow, and he took a blade to the stone and wrote his name. Not in Greek, not in Latin, in runes, in the alphabet of his own people, the same script that was carved on memorial stones back home to mark the dead and honor the living and say to the future, we were here. What did it cost him, that small act of devotion? Was it done in a moment of restlessness during a long imperial ceremony? The emperor enthroned below, the liturgy droning, the incense rising thick and sweet? Or was it something more deliberate, more tender, a man impossibly far from home, pressing his name into the most permanent thing he could find? You have done this yourself, perhaps. Scratched your name or your initials into a desk, a wall, the bark of a tree, not because anyone would read it, but because the act of writing made you real in a place where you felt invisible. The inscription does not say which it was. It does not need to. He did not write what he felt. He did not write where he came from, or how far he had traveled, or whether the gold light of that impossible church reminded him of anything. Of firelight on a longhouse wall, perhaps, or of sunlight on water in some half-remembered northern bay. He wrote only his name, Halfdan, and the marble held it, as marble does, patient, indifferent, faithful. The marble holds it still. There is a moment in every great voyage when the known world simply ends, not with a wall, not with a warning carved in stone, but with a silence so complete it presses against the ears like deep water, and the horizon ahead holds nothing the traveler can name, and the wind carries a scent that belongs to no memory, no story, no god they have ever spoken to. The Norse who sailed west from Greenland sometime around the year 1000 crossed that threshold in open boats, their sails catching a wind that blew from a continent no European mind had yet imagined, their hulls riding swells that darkened from the gray-green of the North Atlantic into something deeper, colder, faintly tinted with the mineral bloom of rivers, draining forests so vast they might have swallowed Scandinavia and still stretched on. They did not know what they were finding. They did not know they were making history. They were looking, the sagas tell us, for timber. The Grenlandinga Saga and the Saga of Eiríkur the Red, two Icelandic manuscripts set down in the 13th century, but describing events 200 years earlier, name Leif Eiriksson as the leader of the first deliberate westward voyage from Greenland. He was the son of Eiríkur the Red, the man who had colonized that vast ice-sheathed island, and he appears to have inherited his father's restless appetite for the edge of the map. The sagas describe a sequence of landfalls as the crew worked south along an unfamiliar coast, a place of flat stones they called Helluland, likely Baffin Island, a place of white sand beaches and dense forest they called Markland, likely the coast of Labrador, and then, farther south still, a shore where the rivers ran with salmon, larger than any they had seen, where the grass stayed green deep into winter, and where they found vines heavy with fruit. They called this place Vinland, the land of wine. Imagine you are standing on that shore for the first time. The air is unlike anything you have known, not the sharp mineral cold of Greenland, not the volcanic sulfur of Iceland, not the salt and pine of Norway. This air is thick with the scent of spruce resin, of wet moss, of decaying leaves layered so deep into the forest floor that the smell is almost sweet, almost fermented, as though the land itself has been breathing quietly for millennia, with no one to hear it. Underfoot, the ground gives softly, spongy, damp, carpeted with moss that holds water like a wrung cloth. The sound is what strikes you most. There are no sheep, no church bells, no iron on an anvil, only the low, constant murmur of a river running over stones, and the wind moving through spruce boughs with a hiss that is softer, wetter, darker than anything a Nordic pine has ever made. You have no word for this place. You have no story that contains it. For centuries, the Vinland sagas were treated as beautiful legend, evocative, stirring, but no more reliable than tales of sea serpents or enchanted islands that vanished at dawn. Scholars debated endlessly. Some placed Vinland as far south as New England, some in the Chesapeake, some nowhere at all. And then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, arrived at the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, at a windswept place the local fishermen called Lance aux Meadows. The name was likely a corruption of the French Lance aux Meadows, Jellyfish Cove, though no one is entirely certain. What Helge Ingstad found there, guided by a local man named George Decker, who led him across the headland to a series of faint ridges in the grass near the shore, would quietly redraw the map of human history. Beneath those grassy ridges lay the remains of 8 Norse buildings, timber-framed, turf-walled structures of a type unmistakably Scandinavian. Anne Stein Ingstad led the painstaking excavations over the years that followed, and the earth yielded its testimony piece by piece. A bronze cloak pin of a style common in Norse settlements, iron rivets of the kind used in ship repair, a small stone anvil, the residue of bog iron smelting in a forge no larger than a garden shed. Radiocarbon dating placed the occupation at approximately 1000 AD. This was not legend. This was not saga embroidered over centuries of retelling. This was iron in the ground, carbon in the wood, the indisputable signature of Norse hands working Norse tools on a shore 4,000 miles west of their homeland. Lance aux Meadows was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978. It remains the only confirmed Norse archaeological site anywhere in the Americas. And still the site continued to speak. Among the artifacts recovered from the dark, waterlogged peat was a small object, easily overlooked, no larger than a coin. A spindle whorl, a disc of soapstone used to weight the spindle in textile production, a tool used almost exclusively by women. Its presence reshaped the story. The expedition to Vinland was not merely a scouting party of armed men. Women had come. They had packed their tools alongside the axes and the dried fish. They had intended, it seems, to stay. This small stone disc, resting now in a museum case, confirms what the sagas also describe: that families sailed across the Atlantic, that women spun thread and wove cloth on a shore their mothers could never have imagined, and that this crossing was not a raid, but something more tender. It was a beginning. Picture that spindle whirl in your hands, the soapstone cool and smooth against your fingertips, a slight groove worn into its surface by years of use, the weight of it satisfying in the palm, the kind of object that becomes so familiar to its owner that she barely notices it until it is gone. Someone carried it across the open Atlantic in the belly of a ship. Someone chose, when the hold was being loaded and every ounce mattered, not to leave it behind. There is a detail here, one that emerged only recently, that anchors this entire story to a single, luminous point in time. In 2021, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Nature that employed an extraordinary technique: the analysis of a known cosmic ray event. In the year 993 AD, a burst of cosmic radiation struck the Earth's atmosphere and left a distinctive signature in the growth rings of every living tree on the planet. By counting the rings outward from that marker in 3 separate pieces of wood recovered at Longships meadows, wood that had been cut with iron tools, tools the indigenous peoples of Newfoundland did not possess. The researchers established that the Norse were felling trees at the site in exactly 1021 AD. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. It is the most precise date ever established for a pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. 1,021 years after the commonly accepted start of the modern era, on the edge of a boreal forest that smelled of spruce and cold river water and earth that had never known an iron blade, someone swung an axe into a living tree, and the tree recorded the year of its own felling in its final ring. The sagas tell us the Norse encountered people already living along these shores, people they called Skraelings, a word whose exact meaning scholars still debate, though it may derive from an Old Norse term for dried skin, possibly a reference to the animal hides these peoples wore. The encounters, as the sagas describe them, began with cautious curiosity and ended in conflict. There was trade at first. The Norse offered strips of red cloth, and the Skraelings brought animal pelts, gray furs that smelled of smoke and tallow. But the relationship fractured. The sagas record skirmishes, a growing recognition that this land, however rich its rivers, however mild its winters, would not yield easily to their presence. The Skraelings knew this country. The Norse did not, and they were few. And so, after perhaps 3 winters, 3 cycles of salmon running silver in unfamiliar rivers, of frost forming on spruce needles, of strange constellations wheeling lower overhead than any sky they had known, the Norse packed their ships and left Vinland. They sailed back to Greenland, back to the known world, back to the narrow archipelago of memory and kinship, where every fjord had a name, and every name had a saga folded inside it. They did not return in force. They did not send for reinforcements or petition a distant king. The most extraordinary geographical discovery of the entire medieval world simply, quietly, closed behind them, like a door in a half-remembered dream. We will never know entirely why they abandoned it. Scholars have offered careful reasons. The distance from the Greenland colonies was too great for reliable supply. The resistance of the indigenous population made settlement untenable. The Norse simply lacked the numbers to sustain a foothold on a continent so deeply inhabited. All of these may carry truth. None of them quite accounts for the strange, heavy silence that followed. The 500 years during which Europe knew nothing of a landmass that one small group of Norse men and women had already touched, already slept upon, under unfamiliar stars. 5 centuries before Columbus stepped ashore in the Caribbean, believing he had reached Asia, a woman on the northern tip of Newfoundland sat beside a turf wall in the early morning cold, drew wool across a spindle weighted with a small stone disc, and listened to the river and the wind in the spruce trees, and nothing else. Because for 1,000 miles in every direction, there was no other sound she would have recognized as home. There is a field in Uppland, in the heart of Sweden, where the grass grows long in summer and bends under a wind that carries the smell of warm earth and clover and something older, the mineral breath of stone that has stood in the same place for 1,000 years. The runestone rises from the meadow like a shoulder blade, gray and mottled with lichen, its surface cool even in July, and if you were to press your palm against it, you would feel the shallow channels where someone once carved letters into granite with an iron chisel, stroke by patient stroke, until a name appeared. The birds sing here. They have always sung here, and the stone says what it has always said in the same voice to anyone who pauses long enough to read it. Approximately 6,000 runestones survive across Scandinavia. Sweden alone holds around 3,000 of them, the largest concentration anywhere in the world. Most date from the 10th and 11th centuries, that late bright flare of the Viking Age, when Christianity was arriving and the old ways were shifting underfoot like spring ice. They stand in churchyards and farmers' fields, beside roads and rivers, built into the walls of medieval churches, lying face down in ditches where they were dragged centuries ago and forgotten. Some are enormous, taller than a person, broader than outstretched arms. Others are modest, knee-high, half-buried. All of them say, in essence, the same thing. X raised this stone in memory of Y. That is the formula. It appears on stone after stone after stone, with small variations, a relationship specified, a virtue named, a journey mentioned. But the bones of the sentence never change. Someone lived. Someone else refused to let that life disappear without a mark. And so they found a stone, and they hired a carver, or they picked up the chisel themselves, and they cut the words into a surface harder than anything they would ever touch in their brief lives, because they understood, perhaps without ever articulating it, that granite outlasts memory, that a name carved in rock might survive when the sound of a voice does not. What is remarkable, what scholars have noted again and again when studying these inscriptions, is what the stones choose to remember. The most common virtue recorded on a runestone is not courage in battle. It is not the number of enemies slain or the fame of distant raids. The most common praise is quiet, domestic, almost humble. He was the best of landowners. She was a good mistress of the household. He was generous with food. She kept the farm well. These were the things that mattered most to the people who actually lived in the Norse world, not the saga heroes with their blood feuds and dragon ships, but the neighbor who shared grain in a hard winter, the mother who held a household together after her husband sailed and did not return. The stones remember what the sagas forgot: the ordinary life, the quiet virtue, the steady hand. Imagine you are standing before one of these stones on a summer evening in Sweden. The light is long and golden, the way it only is at these latitudes, where the sun takes hours to set and the sky holds color, like a bowl holds water. You can smell the grass, that particular Swedish summer smell of timothy and buttercup and warm soil. And beneath it, the faint, cool scent of the stone itself, which carries no warmth, no matter how long the sun has touched it. You reach out. Your fingertips find the carved lines. They are shallow, perhaps a centimeter deep, but distinct, and as your finger traces them, you can feel each rune as a separate gesture, a separate moment when someone struck iron against rock and a small bright chip flew away into the grass. There is a detail about these stones that most people do not know, one that changes the way you see them entirely. The runestones were painted. Their carved lines were filled with vivid color, red and black and white, so that they blazed against the landscape, visible from great distances across the flat Swedish countryside. They were not the mute gray monuments we see today. They were declarations, bright as banners, shouting a name into the wind. The paint has faded over 1,000 years of rain and frost and sun, leaving only the bare granite behind, and so we have come to think of them as solemn, austere, silent things. But the people who raised them intended the opposite. They wanted these stones to be seen. They wanted the name to carry. And still the wind moves through the birch leaves at the edge of the field, making that particular dry, papery sound, half whisper, half applause, that birches have made in Scandinavia since the ice retreated. A thrush sings from somewhere in the canopy, its song liquid and repeating, and beneath it there is another sound, or perhaps not a sound at all, but an absence of sound, the immense, depthless quiet of a place where nothing is happening, where the only motion is grass bending and straightening, and the only clock is the slow crawl of shadow across stone. This is what 1,000 years sounds like. Not silence exactly, but a hush so deep it has texture. Soft, layered, immense. 6,000 stones, 6,000 acts of refusal. Each one says, "This person will not vanish." Each one says, "I was here, and I loved someone, and I will make the earth remember it." We do not know most of the people named on these stones. We cannot find them in any saga or chronicle or court record. They were farmers and fishermen and mothers and smiths, people whose lives left no other trace in the historical record, no document, no coin, no seal. They lived and worked and raised children and grew old or did not grow old, and when they died, someone who loved them spent what must have been a considerable sum. Hiring a stone carver was not cheap, to ensure that their name would remain in the world after their body had left it. Think of that. Think of what it means to choose permanence in a world where nothing lasts, where ships rot, where timber halls burn, where even the sea forgets the shape of a keel. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight of that. Not the stone, though the stone is heavy, hundreds of kilograms of rough granite hauled from a quarry and set upright in the earth, but the weight of the decision. Someone stood in a field not unlike this one and chose a spot. They chose it carefully, perhaps beside a road where travelers would pass, perhaps on a ridge where the stone would stand against the sky. They watched as the carver worked, as the runes took shape one by one, the name of the dead emerging from raw rock, the way a face emerges from memory, slowly, then all at once. And when the paint was applied, that vivid red, that stark black, and the stone stood bright and new against the green of the field, they must have felt something that we can still feel, standing here 1,000 years later. The quiet, fierce satisfaction of having made something that would last. The Viking Age, as historians define it, began around 793 and ended around 1066. In those roughly 270 years, the Norse people built ships that crossed the Atlantic, founded cities from Dublin to Kiev, traded with Baghdad, served as the personal guard of the Byzantine emperor, composed poetry of devastating beauty, and established legal assemblies that would echo through centuries of democratic thought. They were warriors and poets, farmers and explorers, lawmakers and merchants. They were, in every sense, a people who refused to be small. The world remembers them for all of this, but the runestones ask us to remember something else. But the most lasting thing they left behind was not a kingdom or a trade route or a saga. It was a name, cut into stone, placed in a field, left for the wind and the rain and the centuries, and eventually for you. The light is fading now over Uppland. The thrush has gone quiet. The grass has taken on that deep gold that comes just before dusk, when every blade seems to hold its own small portion of the day's last warmth, and the air cools against your arms and carries the green smell of evening, damp earth, the first exhalation of dew, the distant sweetness of birch sap. The stone stands where it has always stood. The runes say what they have always said, and the name, a name you have never heard before, a name that belongs to someone who tilled soil and mended fences and watched the same sun lower itself behind the same tree line 1,000 years ago. That name is still here. It has not moved. It has not faded. It was carved by someone who understood, in the way that all grieving people understand, that love must be made physical or it will be lost, that a name spoken only in memory will eventually fall silent. But a name cut in stone will go on speaking long after the voice that first spoke. It has dissolved into the same dark earth beneath the grass. The wind moves once more through the field, bending the grass over the base of the stone, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. A single low note that travels across the flat land, and then is gone. The sky deepens. The first star appears, and the stone stands, patient and illegible in the gathering dark, holding its name the way a cupped hand holds water, carefully, gently, knowing that even this will not last forever, but unwilling, even now, to let it go.